and sometimes worlds beyond. They are famous for more than 15 minutes. We know their names and faces, marvel at their accomplishments, wonder where they might take us next. And yet there is a distance between us. We know them only through light and sound, as pixels on a screen, ink on a printed page, waves from a speaker, until tonight, and others like it. Tonight we share the same room with someone known only from a distance. Feel the humanity we have in common, and come to know ourselves and our world even more at the Richmond Forum. Tonight, 3 perspectives on the nature and image of the world's second largest religion. 1 vocal critic, 1 former extremist, 1 respected cleric, and 1 recurring question. Islam, a religion of violence or peace? Welcome.
Good evening, I'm John Donvan. It is one of the time-honored rules of good etiquette that in polite company you do not discuss politics or religion. Well, obviously we're going to be hitting one of those words, religion, tonight. Come to think of it, we might get into politics a little bit as well. But it is the third word that I hope that we all end up living up to here, polite, because we start out knowing that it is a sensitive thing to be exploring and also weighing the peacefulness of someone else's closely held religious beliefs, even when the challenge made to those claims can also be made in good faith. So we just want to say at the start of us that all 4 of us on this stage are committed to keeping this conversation civil and appropriate and fair-minded and polite, because that is how we hope to shed light on the question. All three of our panelists will take about 5 minutes each in turn to answer the opening question, the question before us, whether Islam is a religion of violence or of peace. They will go in turn, and they will each come to this lectern, one at a time. And we will begin first with Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Born and raised a Muslim, as an adult, she walked away from that faith, and all faiths, in fact, declaring herself an atheist, offended in particular with the treatment she has seen of girls and women in some Muslim countries. She has become as outspoken a critic of Islam as there is anywhere. Death threats stalk her as a result of that. What she has to say now on the question before us, is Islam a religion of violence or peace? Let's hear her answer. Welcome to the lectern.
Thank you very much, John. My father, the man responsible for my education, taught me that Islam, rightly understood, is a religion and philosophy of peace. In fact, he said that for any society to be peaceful and prosperous, it had to institute the rule of God, or Sharia. I came to disagree with my father. It was a gradual process that started when I entered and lived in societies such as the Netherlands and the United States that applied man-made constitutions and laws. Both countries are peaceful and prosperous. I now disagree even more with my father that Islam is a religion of peace. When I look at the amount of security that is deployed tonight here, the amount of security that is deployed for the Richmond Marathon, 6 months ago, the Boston Marathon was bombed by two brothers who invoked the founding documents and the founding father of Islam. I disagree with my father when I look at the wanton killing of the Westgate Mall in Nairobi by Somali men invoking Allah and Muhammad to justify their horrid act. Kenya is the most hospitable country to Somalis fleeing their own country, so it distresses me even more. I disagree with my father when I look at the report this week of 30 men and women worshipping in Iraq who are killed by a suicide bomber invoking the very same God and the very same prophet that they invoke. I disagree with my father when he says that Islam is a religion of peace. When I look at the 120,000 dead in Syria, Syria is now a stage of a proxy war between Islam's two most important and most influential nations, the Sunni Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Shia Islamic Republic of Iran. I disagree with my father that Islam is a religion of peace when I read about the almost daily reports of the destruction of churches, the pillaging of Christian property, the rape of Christian women, the terrible exodus of Christians and other religious minorities from Muslim countries. All this is done by men who invoke the founding father and founding documents of Islam. I disagree with my dear beloved father when I read about the teenage girl in Pakistan who's shot point blank in the head by a man invoking Allah and Muhammad because she wanted education. In the name of Allah and Muhammad, women are forbidden to drive. They're forbidden to own their own reproductive rights. They're forbidden to do anything unless they have permission from a male guardian. I disagree with my father that Islam is a religion of peace when I read these founding documents and I study the history and the example of the Prophet Muhammad. In there, I find an insistence of war and intolerance towards infidels, the hypocrites, those who associate God with others, homosexuals, women, and so on. What Islam needs is not a denial of these overwhelming and compelling facts. Islam needs a reformation. Muslim leaders who are serious about achieving true and enduring peace need to revise the Quran and the Hadith so that there is a consistency between what the peace-loving Muslims want and what their religion says. We are now in America. Imam Faisal Abdul Rauf here tonight likes to compare the American Constitution to Sharia law. The Constitution is only 225 years old, and it has been amended 27 times. The Quran is at least 1,200 years old. It has not been amended once. What a shame. It is urgent and imperative to start these amendments. It's time to innovate, innovate, innovate. And I will do, ladies and gentlemen, what I can do to help. Thank you.
Maajid Nawaz, a Muslim, a British subject. He embraced a radical Islam as a teenager, and he signed up for the jihad, joining a radical movement, which led to his arrest and imprisonment in Egypt. And it was while he was there behind bars that he underwent a conversion. He came out of prison committed to peace, but he came out of prison still a practicing, believing Muslim. His journey covers the full range of the question before us this evening: is Islam a religion of violence or peace? The answer, as provided to us by Maajid Nawaz. Maajid, you can use this lectern if you like.
Thank you. I speak to you today here as somebody who's come from the trenches, as somebody who from the age of 16 years old onwards was dedicated to a vision that Islam was indeed a religion of war and violence, as somebody who took that message and spread it to other countries for the purpose of creating revolution for what I now refer to as my Islamist ideology, to bring it to power, to conquer the rest of the world. From those trenches, I witnessed torture in the prisons of Egypt. And there for 4 years, I dedicated myself to studying further this ideology with the initial intention that I could become an even more potent recruiter for that cause. I became fluent in the Arabic language and I began studying from the original sources of Islam. And the one thing that struck me, that forced me to reconsider my position, to change my mind for a cause I was prepared to die for, was I learnt from studying the original sources of Islam that ideas and disputes that we were prepared to overthrow governments for had traditionally been debated through the pages of books between the theologians themselves over cups of tea. Upon my release from prison, it became impossible for me to sustain my position within the leadership of the Islamist organization that I joined. I want to correct my introduction by saying one thing. I'm not a devout Muslim. I make no pretense to be a religious leader. In fact, I never was. My conversion to Islamism was a political revolution with religious connotations. It was not a religious revolution with political connotations. I don't hold myself out to be devout, but I do maintain that I remain a Muslim. And when I speak and when I discuss, I speak politically, I speak ideologically. And I'm still in the trenches. I frequent Pakistan. In fact, Ayan mentioned Malala, the young girl who was shot in the head by the Taliban. Within that very month, I was there in her city in Mangora, organizing a public debate to discuss the root causes of extremism in defiance of the Taliban. Because the conclusion I came to through my studies in prison was one conclusion, and that Islam is not a religion of violence, but it's also not a religion of peace. And in saying this, I sit between my two co-panelists here. In fact, ladies and gentlemen, Islam is a religion. Like all other religions on this planet, from time immemorial, it's been interpreted. It's been interpreted, like Christianity has in the past, to cause much devastation on this earth. And it's also been interpreted towards peaceful ends. Islam is a religion. So then the question is, next, how do we define this religion if essentially it's not one of peace or violence? It's by the majority of Muslims who interpret it today. And this poses two particularly acute challenges. One is, yes, the majority of Muslims today are not terrorists. Even Ayan will concede this. The majority of Muslims today are not terrorists. And so one can confidently say that Islam is not a religion of terrorism if we're defining the religion by its followers. However, that doesn't get us off scot-free as Muslims. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing what I do to challenge extremism around the world. Because the majority of Muslims today are yet to arrive in any form of tangible, concrete way to what we would understand as liberal, democratic systems of governance. And so, though Islam today cannot be classified as a religion of terrorism, it also doesn't make sense to classify Islam today as a religion of harmony, of tolerance, because of course we see around the world that there's much mayhem. More Muslims are killing each other today than any non-Muslim is killing them. So Muslims today are thrown into deep confusion. But it doesn't help in this cause, in this struggle, which is all of our struggle, to essentialize Islam and to say it's a religion of violence. To go to Muslims in Pakistan like I do and say, you've got two choices. Either you subscribe to the interpretation of your religion that bin Laden had, which is essentially it's a religion of war and terrorism, or you leave Islam because the only good Muslim is an ex-Muslim. Even Malala Yousafzai doesn't make this argument, the girl that was shot in the head by the Taliban. Because if you try and make that argument in Pakistan, ladies and gentlemen, I will assure you, you will lose the debate. Because no Muslim wants to be told that the only good Muslim is an apostate. Rather, the way forward is to say, yes, Islam is a religion that can be interpreted. Isn't it better for us to promote the fact that there are Muslims out there risking their very lives to reinterpret this faith and to demonstrate and promote and to encourage those interpretations that do take a genuine look at Scripture and that do recognize that we have two twin challenges that are dominating Muslim majority countries today. The first, the ideology of Islamism, which overly politicizes the faith. Islamism, briefly defined as the desire to impose any given interpretation of the faith over society. There's that one challenge there. The other challenge manifests itself on a social level, and that's the challenge of fundamentalism. Not every fundamentalist wants to impose and take over governments, but they have very ultra-conservative social mores. Manifestations such as forced marriage, female genital mutilation, honor killings. These may not necessarily come from the Islamists, the organized political groups, but they do come from fundamentalists. And these two twin challenges are currently suffocating political and social debate and discourse within Muslim majority countries. There is no larger challenge than to confront these two. So I ask you, ladies and gentlemen, to consider this question in supporting people who are genuinely attempting to reform this discourse from within, because if that's the only way forward. And I'll tell you this now, we mentioned the Reformation. Martin Luther, by today's standards, was a Christian fundamentalist. Martin Luther, the man who broke Christianity away from the church, was a deeply, deeply ultra-conservative, some would say devout man. But if it wasn't for that discourse coming from within Christianity, we would not have had the Reformation, and we would not be enjoying the secularism that all of us fight to protect today. Thank you very much.
Faisal Abdul Rauf, American. Faisal Abdul Rauf, Muslim. Having both of these identities and putting them together and then reaching out to Americans of our other identities has been part of the life's work of the Imam from New York City, who has so often found himself as the man called upon to explain Islam to Americans who are curious enough to ask to know more, as we are doing right now. Imam Faisal and his answer to whether Islam is a religion of violence or peace.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here in this space known as a mosque, once known as the mosque, and therefore it is pleasing to me that Islam has shaped this space, at least in the architectural sense. Thank you. The discourse that we just heard underlines why it is extremely important for us to have a very clear understanding as to what we mean by the terms that we use. I think it is very dangerous in an increasingly multicultural and internet world to claim that any religion, be it Islam, be it Christianity, be it Judaism, be it Hinduism or Buddhism, is a religion of war or of violence. I believe that every religion, every authentic revelation from the Creator to humanity was about peace, about the two fundamental commandments that are common to all of our faith traditions: to love the Lord, our God, our Creator, with all of our heart, our minds, our souls, and our strength, and to love our fellow human beings as we love ourselves. In a famous tradition, we believe that the Archangel Gabriel came and visited the Prophet while he was seated with his companions, and he asked the Prophet, "What is Islam?" And the Prophet answered, "Islam is to bear witness that there is no God but God, and that Muhammad is his prophet," meaning all the prophets, because we believe that all the prophets were sent by God. To perform the daily prayer, to give charity, to fast, in our case to fast the month of Ramadan, and to pilgrim to Mecca, whoever can afford it physically and financially. That is the classical understanding of what Islam is. Muslims are a different story. Christians are a different story. Buddhists are a different story. We are inspired by that. And I am convinced that the purpose of all religions is to bring human beings to the vision of God, to enable us to see God. In fact, the very fundamental testimony of Islam is to witness that there is no God but the one God. And from my own experience and the experience of those whom I know who have gone through this experience, when a human being is touched by the vision of God, he or she becomes totally transformed. But there have been, throughout history, and in the last 30 years, especially 40 years of our common history, we have seen, in the case of Muslims, a great deal of violence committed by Muslims, both against non-Muslims and against their own selves. This is the fundamental tragedy that exists in the Muslim world today. But I think it is false. I'm convinced it is a misunderstanding of even the concepts of what religion is about, that we call any religion violent. We cannot afford that. And we have to reframe the discourse. I just finished reading a book which I think many of you would find interesting. It's called Positive Deviance, in which this group of scholars identified people who deviated from the norm and how to shift the norm. And one of the key lessons was you have to shift the frame of the discourse. The discourse is not Islam versus the West, or Muslims versus Christians, or Muslims versus Hindus. If we are going to solve this problem, we must shift the discourse as between extremists of all faith traditions against, for lack of a better term, the moderates of all faith traditions. For I and many of my fellow faith traditionists from various traditions have felt closer. I feel closer to many Jewish friends, Christian friends, atheist friends, Buddhist friends, than I am to many of my fellow Muslims whose attitude and worldview is fundamentally at odds with my own. And so do my fellow Jewish friends and fellow Christian friends feel that about their own relationships with people within their faith communities. The violence in Myanmar against Muslims today is not at all, and I cannot accept it as being expressive of the teachings of the Buddha. I cannot believe that what Christians did during the Inquisition, or Christians did in many other countries, including this country, the United States, expressed the values of the Prince of Peace, Jesus Christ. And therefore we today have to reframe the discourse. Because by reframing the discourse, we can gain traction. And I'll leave you with one analogy. We have had a government shutdown in the United States recently. And you can insist that the discourse is between Republicans and Democrats. But we know from the way our government works that it's the moderates on both sides who make government work. We've had a situation in our country where out of a group of 500 members of Congress in this House and the Senate, 50, you might call them extremist Republicans, were able to shut this government down. If we insist that the discourse must be one between Democrats and Republicans, it's going to be hard to solve this problem. But if we can reframe the discourse between moderates on both sides against the extremists of both sides, then we have hope of generating the middle, because it's always the middle that governs, it's always the middle that rules. And if the Republican Party had such difficulty that 50 extremists could eliminate the moderates, people like Richard Lugar and many of those who many of you know, who are regarded as moderates in the Republican Party, how much more difficult it must be with a worldwide population of 1.5 billion. The battle against the extremists within our faith tradition is an important one, but one that has to be done not only by Muslims alone, Muslims on certain fronts, but Muslims and people of other traditions on common fronts. There's much more that I can say, but I'll leave you with this opening remark, and that is why we have established and I've promoted and championed the importance of a global coalition of moderates to combat the extremists on all our sides, to identify the issues that are important, which, as Maajid said, are primarily political, and to find a way to address them for the benefit of our children and our grandchildren and peace on this world that we love. Thank you very much, and may God bless you all.
And I just want to invite one more round of applause for all three of these panelists for these strong opening statements. That was very rich. You just all three gave us a lot to think about already, but let's chat about some of it. It seems to me I've heard common ground already in the obvious sense that all three of you condemn violence perpetrated in the name of religion. All three of you, I think, also acknowledge that the majority of people who identify as Muslims around the world are not engaged in violence. It seems to me that where there is some difference is this question of whether the acts of violence by a small minority define the faith or are a perversion and a hijacking of the faith. And I want to go first to you, Ayaan Hirsi Ali. We just heard Imam Faisal make the point. He made an analogy to historical episodes of wrongdoing by faiths that are more familiar. For example, in Richmond, Virginia, Christian faith. Of course, historically, wars have been fought by Christians with each other and against other groups, and yet there's no tendency in our culture, therefore, to say that there's fundamentally something wrong at the root of Christianity and its definition. And I'd like to ask you why you make that leap in the case of Islam and Muslims.
What I do is I listen to the men, mostly they are men. There are some women, mostly men, who invoke the founding documents of Islam and the founding father of Islam. And I look at what they say, and then I think, is that in the Quran? For instance, as you probably all know, I'm very much concerned about the subjection of women. So when I read a verse in the Quran that says that men are the maintainers of women and that husbands are allowed to hit their wives, I look at that verse in a way and I think you can read that in context, in its historical context, or you can apply it to our times. And the men who are doing that, who are applying all of these verses and the example of the Prophet Muhammad, not to the 7th century, but to our time, I find, and it's very unfortunate, but I find them to be far more influential in inspiring and mobilizing young men to see the religion of Islam the way they see it than the way either Imam Faisal says he sees it or Maajid Nawaz says he sees it. And that's a fact. You know, you look at Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda does not use bin Laden to recruit new people. Al-Qaeda uses the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad to recruit young men. So that we have to stop this denial and at some point try and address the influence of these documents. And the way to do it is to, to look at what is in there and not deny it. Well, it's just the denial that is so incredibly frustrating.
Let me ask Maajid then. You've in a sense lived both sides of the equation that Ayaan was just describing. And in the opening, I mistakenly referred to you as a practicing Muslim, and you point out, and I apologize for that, you clarify the nuance should be that you identify as a Muslim. But the difference between who you were when you were a radical and who you are now, it says what about that identification with Islam that you have?
Well, I wasn't raised as what people refer to as a practicing Muslim, and my path towards the Islamist ideology, and perhaps this touches upon something that Ayan has just spoken about, my path to the Islamist ideology wasn't actually through the Quran or the teachings of the Prophet. Two things happened. I was born in Essex in the UK, an area next door to London, and the first thing was that I experienced some very severe and violent racism domestically, and the second was that I was witnessing the genocide unfold in Bosnia, which for us European born and raised Muslims was round the corner, next door, figuratively speaking, and touched us deeply. And these two, they manifested in a form of identity politics in Britain. So Islam suddenly became not only a politicized form of our identity, but a revolutionary call for change. And in fact, the only serious occasion I had to study the religion was, this all happened at 16, yeah? So I joined the group at 16. By 24, I was imprisoned in Egypt after having co-founded the group from Britain to 3 other countries. I became the equivalent of the Communist Internationale for Islamists. We were exporting that revolution. The only occasion I had to study the original scriptures was after I was imprisoned, after I had then learnt Arabic. And so I suppose this is also a way of addressing what my colleague Ayan has just mentioned, which is that if you look at the path in for the majority of specifically Western radicalized individuals, it's rarely through scripture, and the radicalization rarely occurs in mosques. I never frequented a mosque. It's usually through a form of politicized ideological discourse that they arrive at these conclusions, and it's usually a mixture of identity politics, poisonous identity politics, something that isn't alien here to America. I mean, the civil rights movement had this same division. We had the Martin Luther Kings on the one hand, but on the other hand, we had groups such as the Black Panthers and the Nation of Islam that played up the identity politics agenda and what it meant to be African American.
So you're saying it does not come through the scripture, and I want to go to Imam Faisal on that. I assume you know a little bit about what's in the Quran. Yes, you've worked at this. And Ayan is making the argument in her opening statement that the actual foundational scripture, the words of the prophets, need to be revised and reformed because the violence that she was referring to, she says, is inherent there. And I'm a little bit worried about asking this question because none of us in the audience, or few of us, are in a position to judge any sort of dueling scripture type of conversation. So I want to discourage that, but I want to ask in the sort of fundamental sense, is it accurate that there is support in any way for the kind of violence, or could it be interpreted easily as an easy liftoff from what's in the Quran to turn into calls to violence?
The Quran is a record of 23 years worth of revelation in different contexts. Unfortunately, in the last century, there has been a discontinuation of tradition of scholarship. From the very early times, a group of scholars have studied the Quran, studied the teachings of the Prophet, and what we call Sharia is actually a creative work. It's a creative work which evolved over several centuries by jurists who developed an understanding of Islamic jurisprudence. And they developed both an understanding based upon not only the verses of the Quran, the teachings of the Prophet, and the precedents of his companions who began to rule. Umar, for example, the second caliph, when he conquered Jerusalem, recognized the Christians, and many people don't know this fact even. It was Umar who actually invited Jews to come back and take residence in Jerusalem. So the collective history and this tradition of a continuous jurisprudence and understanding has been part of our tradition. In the 20th century, some very major things happened which discontinued this tradition of scholarship as being dominant. And a lot of people who felt they could read the Quran directly and arrive at their conclusions developed new ideas which are alien to this tradition of scholarship. Ideas such as an Islamic State, which is an incoherent concept. Ideas which is now splitting the whole Muslim world from Morocco to Indonesia, Sunni against Sunni, as we see in Egypt today and in Tunisia, around the concept of Islamic State. It's an incoherent idea, but it's creating a lot of divisiveness and unnecessary violence in many of that region. The concept of, we have to de-link the idea of authoritarianism or extremism from religion. You can have, under the Soviet Union, we had a militant, extremist, authoritarian atheism, which was proselytized. It doesn't mean atheists are authoritarian. It doesn't mean atheism is something which, is fundamentally anti-American. Many Americans are atheists or agnostic. So what has happened, we have had an increasing authoritarianism in many countries of the Muslim world today, and which has become the bane of what we are seeing. But the rise of this militant Islam really is a product of some historical narratives which developed in the last century. Mm-hmm. The rise of people here may not remember, except people of my age, that the Mujahideen was something which was developed by Pakistan in conjunction with Saudi Arabia and the United States to fight the Soviets in Afghanistan. And many of the people who were encouraged to go and fight were people who were even criminals. Egypt sent criminals to go and fight in Afghanistan. Mujahideen were VIPs in the Reagan White House, if you remember that. They were welcomed by Reagan and they were championed by Reagan. Unfortunately, the ideology that was developed to fight the Soviets and these individuals were not reintegrated back into society. Mm-hmm. Just like if you have war veterans go into Iraq and they're not integrated and not supported.
May I interrupt to take your point, the point though that you were making in the center of what you were just saying, and take it to Ayan, that the Imam is making the point that the kinds of misbehavior, for want of a better term, that is expressed through Islam of the types you're describing is a rather recent development. That, in other words, if we were to go back 250 years, we wouldn't see the Muslim world acting in that way in any fashion, any sort of political fashion, aggressive fashion. What's your response to that?
Well, my response is that I respectfully disagree. Islam was founded by Muhammad, who proclaimed to be a prophet, and in the early years in Mecca, he emphasized what we now would describe as religion, prayer, fasting, charity, taking care of the orphans. But then later, in his time in Medina, when he developed a following that was large enough to organize a militia, then the revelations he said he was receiving from God changed, and they became more military, and he became militaristic. And if you look at the history of Islam from that time in Medina up to now, what you see is, first of all, an intertwining of politics and religion. And conquest after conquest. And when these conquests were made, then God's word was applied, or at least there was an attempt to apply divine law to govern. And yes, in the last 200 years after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, Islam has found itself on the defensive. And the answer to that, to say Western ascendancy and Western imperialism, is where I think the Imam sort of begins history, and where are these two different strands and two different voices. One group of people saying we need to copy the West, that is separate religion from politics, as did Kemal Atatürk in Turkey, and several others saying no, we need to you cannot really be a Muslim, and you cannot be a Muslim society unless you are ruled under the Sharia. That debate dialogue or confrontation, whatever you call it, is not over in the Muslim world. And we see that today in Tunisia, we see it today in Egypt. But I think it's just not empirical, it's not supported by the founding documents, it's not supported by the history of Islam to say that, you know, it's just something from the recent past, the recent 100 years. That's just a point we just happen to disagree on.
That's preposterous. Say that I've only started history 200 years ago is not at all what I was saying. And to suggest that is a travesty. The Ottomans, who were in power until 1923, 1925, you know, were a haven.
In 1924, the caliphate was abolished.
Yeah, but the Ottomans ruled until 1923. Okay, until that time, and even thereafter, under Ottoman rule, the Ottomans ruled over Turks, over Greeks, over Arabs, over Bulgarians, over Muslims, Christians, Jews. You know, the people used to come, Jews used to come for safe haven under the Ottoman rule. In India, Muslims ruled over vast numbers of Hindus. If the intention of Muslims from the very beginning were to eliminate any other religion, there would be no other religions under Muslim rule. But until 60 years ago, Alexandria in my country was a majority Greek city. What has happened is that there's some very major fundamental movements which happened in the last century and a half. The idea of a nation state, based upon Islam, which I myself argue are incoherent concepts. These things have developed strands of movements.
What is the travesty? What is preposterous? What did I say that is preposterous?
That my reading of history starts 200 years ago. That's absurd.
Yes, Maajid, please come in.
No.
Let's let Maajid come in.
I kind of, because of the work I do and the cause that I have, see myself between these two positions, in that everything Ayan describes is wrong with Muslim majority countries. I agree with 100%. That the discourse is currently dominated by those who don't interpret Islam in the way that Imam Faisal does, or in the way that I would have everyone, if they wanted to interpret Islam, listen to people like Imam Faisal. And so, of course, when we look at the Middle East, when we look at South Asia, when we look at wherever Muslim majority countries are, there are huge issues there around these topics. And as I said, whether it's the politicization of the faith and the groups that emanate from that strand, the political forms of groups that are related to the Muslim Brotherhood, through to the revolutionary groups such as the one I used to belong to, Hizb ut-Tahrir, all the way through to the violent groups, the terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda, they all come from the strand of Islamism that I described, or the politicization of Islam. And then there are the fundamentalists. The governor of Punjab in Pakistan was assassinated by his own bodyguard because he attempted to reform the blasphemy law in that country. And the sad fact is that the very people, the very phenomenon that have been the fiercest in opposing the strand of Islamism in Pakistan also produced the assassin of the governor of Punjab, because they are ultra-conservative, and the one thing that fuels their fire and angers them is questioning the blasphemy law. And that's the second strand I address, which is the fundamentalist strand. So in Ayan's analysis of what the problem is, I would agree with her. But then when Ayan goes back to the cause and says the cause for that problem is somehow to be found only in the religion of Islam, exclusively.
No. We are talking, the subject tonight is the religion of Islam one of peace or one of violence?
Right, so if I may
the debate
finish.
is not on Christianity or other religions.
Of course.
I know that it is difficult to talk about the violence, but I don't think it's right to continue to change the subject.
Let's let Maajid land
if I may finish, so either we must be consistent. Either the problem is religion per se, or if we don't want to say that, if we don't want to say that every single religion, and there are people that say that, Richard Dawkins is one of them, who is as consistent against Christianity as he is against Islam and Judaism and all faith, full stop. Or we say, okay, if the problem isn't religion per se, then it must be about the way that religion is interpreted. And if that's the point, then I agree with Ayaan that today there are serious challenges with the way Islam is interpreted, and I wish Muslims were doing more to challenge those interpretations, not just in the political sense, but also in the social sense. We need to hear more voices speak out. There are many reasons why they don't.
What are the reasons?
Well, you know, two of us on this stage, I don't know about the Imam, and forgive me, but I hope I am mistaken, but Ayaan and I both live with death threats over our lives. And the reasons for that, just last month, after the Kenya mall attack, the Somali al-Shabaab added me to their hit list of British Muslims.
But you know, it's the fact that you're both under death threats for speaking the way you're speaking that raises the specter of the notion of Islam as a religion of violence. It's a very bad headline.
Of course, well, that's a point that, of course...
And that's really why we're here, and to hear why that's not true.
That's a point that would resonate, except let's remember one thing. It takes one person and their dog to issue a death threat, frankly. You know?
But wait a minute,
it's easy to issue death threats. That doesn't mean the majority of Muslims want to kill us. That means there are groups out there.
I take that point completely, and this is the thing that I keep asking myself. If you all agree, if you all will stipulate that the majority of Muslims are not involved in violence or interested in being involved in violence, and if the behaviors of the people of a particular faith, in my mind, would define that faith, then why does that not tell us, by the virtue of the fact that most Muslims don't want to be involved in violence, that Islam is not a religion of violence?
I think
Isn't it, you walk like a duck and you talk like a duck?
Yes, you walk like, yes, exactly. Quack, quack.
Well, it's because the violent ones are the ones that get the news headlines.
Right.
I mean, you don't get news attention because of being moderate or promoting peace. You get the attention when you commit acts of violence.
Well, look, Yitzhak Rabin was shot by a fanatic Jewish extremist, and nobody leaps from that to thinking that Judaism is an extremely violent religion, even though that young man essentially brings the text to his action. And yet with Islam, that leap is often made, and I'm trying to understand why you think that is.
So I want to point out, we can't...
Actually, I wanted to put the question to Imam Rauf first, and then I'll come to you.
Well, I mean, it is made because that link is not made because as Christians and as Jews, you get it. You understand the political motivation behind it. Mm-hmm. The vast majority of Muslims do not make that link either. The vast majority of Muslims see these things as not legitimately interpreting the religion of Islam or something outside the state of Islam, just like the majority of Jews would not consider the assassin of Yitzhak Rabin as legitimately expressing the Jewish faith. This is very much the case in the vast majority of the Muslim world.
So it's what you're really saying is it's I'm talking collectively, our culture here, it's our not knowing enough about Islam or enough about Muslims?
It's about the way perceptions are shaped. Mm-hmm. Perceptions are shaped by events, very much, for most people. And just like, when I'm in Muslim majority countries, they will say, why is America attacking Islam? They view that. Why? Because when some major in the US military says, we're in Iraq because this is a crusade against Islam, that gets a banner headline in the Muslim world. So that shapes perception in a very powerful way.
Is it the view in the Muslim world that this country, our country, is dedicated to destroying Islam?
There are large numbers of people who feel that way based upon these types of headlines. This is why I said that the cycle of extremist actions and extremist statements get the banner headlines in each country. So when an Ayatollah in Iran saying death to America, this scares Americans, and Americans get this image that the Iranians are out to destroy and Islam is about to destroy America. Mm-hmm. Then you have, a military general who says this, and then somebody commits an act of violence that gets the headlines over here. Then you have a pastor who has only 30 people in Florida saying he's going to burn the Quran, and then it results in acts of violence. So the media grabbing these extremist events helps shapes perceptions and creates this sense of revulsion that people have, and a tendency to then whitewash all of those people and say, well, America's against us or the West is against us.
Ayaan, you've been very patient. Go ahead.
Yeah, I've been very patient. Thank you very much. So, is it the packaging, the marketing, or is it the substance? Okay. in America, in the Western world, there are continuous debates about the place of Muslims. And yes, amongst Muslims in the West and amongst Muslims outside of the West, there is this general belief that Islam is under siege and that Americans want to destroy Islam. That is a matter of perception because it's not supported by facts. Now, we look at Islam, and I look at Islamic countries like Pakistan, and they have blasphemy laws. Part of the constitution of Pakistan is derived from or founded on the Quran or the Hadith. The constitution of Iran is Islamic. The constitution of Saudi Arabia is the Quran. You look at movements like the Muslim Brotherhood and the Islamists in the countries that have sprung up after the Arab Spring, and these movements want to organize society along religious lines. This conflation between politics and religion, this is not something that I am imagining. It's not a packaging problem. It's substantial. So when you give the example of the murderer of Yitzhak Rabin, he is a fringe. The state of Israel is not.
And he's in jail.
And he is in jail. And the Christian extremists here in the United States who take the Bible and then use it to kill people and hurt people, they are the fringe. But unfortunately, what we are seeing in Muslim countries is that the people who feel that they should be governed under the Sharia law are not a fringe. In some countries, they are a mainstream. In some countries, they are a minority. But in any case, it's a huge obstacle that cannot be ignored. And Islam can become a religion of peace if politics is divorced from religion, if science is divorced from religion. And for that, we need a reformation.
Maajid.
So once again, I agree with the conclusion, with the sort of understanding of the situation, but here's my issue. I mean, apart from the factual inaccuracy, just as a point of fact, the blasphemy law in Pakistan is a British instituted colonial era legacy. It was instituted under the British Raj. That's not to say that one can't find support for it within Islamic texts. That's just a correction on a point of fact, but I do accept that there are Islamists out there that find support for it within Islamic texts. But it's important to mention this point only because it touches on what Imam Faisal said, which is there is a mixture of colonial legacy and Islamism that is in this concoction here. It's in the part of the problem we're dealing with. However, on the second point, going forward, if we are able to recognize that Islam can become a religion of peace if it has a reformation, as Ayan just said, then it strikes me that essentially, which I agree with as well, yeah? So essentially then what it means is Islam isn't actually a religion of anything, whether war or peace. It's a religion. Because if it can have a reformation, if it can become a religion of peace, it means it's open to interpretation. And the only problem we're dealing with is that not enough Muslims are interpreting it in that way, which is actually what I'm trying to say. Today, a lot of active Muslims who are dominating the discourse in the Middle East are interpreting it in a way that no one on this panel, on this stage, wants it to be interpreted. But the mere fact we entertain the possibility that it can be interpreted in a different way tells us where the problem lies. The problem lies in the way that people are interpreting it. And we've got to stop cherry-picking texts in this way to say, that's what Islam is, or this is what Islam is. And let's start looking at the people who interpret it. Otherwise, look, at the end of the day, I'll end on this point. Tony Blair and George Bush, when they decided to invade Iraq, Tony Blair spoke to George Bush on the phone, and you know, they both said, "In God we trust." And when Tony Blair was asked in an interview, "Did you pray to God?" And he says, "Yes, I believe God told me to do this." At the end of the day, that doesn't mean that that was a religious invasion. But if in the Middle East and in Pakistan, whenever I go there, that's what I hear. I hear young Muslims in Pakistan saying to me that George Bush used the word crusade, he prayed to God before he invaded Iraq, and Tony Blair converted to Catholicism.
This is probably going to get me in trouble in New York, where we do the Intelligence Squared debates, but we have a portion where we take questions from the audience. And in New York, that's a very difficult process. We have a lot of the questioners actually want to join the debate. And I have to compliment this audience in Richmond for some spectacularly good questions. And there's one, seriously, and they're such perfectly phrased as questions. And Lauren, I don't know where you are, but I love the twist you put on this one. I am curious to know the number one message that Imam Rauf shares with moderate Muslims and the number one question that Mr. Nawaz shares with extremists.
The number one question?
The number one message. I was stuck on the word question. I'm curious to know the number one message that Imam Rauf shares with moderate Muslims and the number one message that Mr. Nawaz shares with extremists.
The number one message is that our faith is a faith that is about submission to God, that it is about worshiping God. It is a faith that comes from the Abrahamic faith tradition. We are part of the Christian and Jewish Abrahamic tradition of religion, of revealed religion. Our laws are very similar, and the whole idea is to establish a community that believes in God, and as I mentioned earlier, that worships the Creator in a state as if we see God. The Prophet described virtue when he was describing Islam, Iman and Ihsan, which means virtue, is to worship God and to serve God as if you see the Creator. And if you do not see the Creator, with the conviction that He sees you. And serving the Creator is not only serving God directly in acts of worship, but also serving humanity, helping the poor, and helping to build a greater concept of humankind.
And I may be reading more into it, but I had the sense that the question also had a connotation of, what do you say to moderate Muslims about extremism in Islam?
Well, we acknowledge, all the things that Ayan is talking about and Maajid's been talking about are things which exist in the Muslim world today. There's no dispute that we are the biggest victims of our own acts of violence. That these acts of violence legitimately come from our faith, the vast majority of Muslims recognize this to be untrue. But this is the battle that is happening right now within the Muslim world, and this is the work which I am devoted to through the Global Movement of Moderates, which I'm doing with a number of Muslim world leaders, in terms of advancing the role of women, which is not uniform across the Muslim world by any means. You have women, we've had 5 women heads of governments in the Muslim world. We have women ministers in many Muslim countries. The role of women is not a common thing. It comes out of a cultural tradition rather than from the faith tradition itself. Even we have programs against FGM in Egypt, which we are doing and trying to scale up. We've had programs on educating imams in Afghanistan. And like anything else, this is a battle. And like any battle, you have your wins and you have your losses, and the opposing side will always try to combat you. But our work is, how do we strategize to build a broader coalition of force that will actually change the discourse for the positive. And I'm an eternal optimist that we can win this battle.
And Maajid, the question to you is, what's your message for the extremists?
Yeah, help me out, guys, because we're always stuck between a rock and a hard place. So, here I'm trying to tell everyone that, look, Islam isn't essentially a religion of violence. It's interpreted. When I go to Pakistan and when I speak to young Muslims who have got every sense of grievance, I'm trying to tell them that America isn't at war with Islam. And America doesn't hate Islam and Muslims. In fact, the West, if one can use such a generalized term, doesn't hate Islam and Muslims. And so when we speak to them, they also cherry pick evidences, like the one we just ended on before the intermission, or others, and they pick these things. They say, well, look, there was a Quran burning session there, and there was this the drone strikes, and they pick on things to prove what I call half-truths. And half-truths aren't the same as lies. It's a lot easier to debunk a lie and to disprove a lie because it's not based in fact. But there are half-true narratives on both sides of this debate. So a half-truth on this side, yes, of course, there are elements within Scripture that are interpreted to justify acts of gross violence today. But of course, that's half the truth, as we've been discussing. On the other side, there's a half-truth because they only pick on elements that justify their own narrative. They say America's at war with Islam and Muslims because, look, Palestine, Kashmir, Bosnia, Iraq, and Muslims are dying everywhere. Guantanamo Bay, extraordinary rendition to torture, waterboarding. These are all things that actually happened, which is why I call them half-truths. And if one were to try and prove any one of these, they can find ample evidence to say these happened. And that's how the young mind gets convinced. But of course, it doesn't tell the other side of the story. That it was the Americans, the American army, that went in to save and defend Muslims in Kosovo, next door to Bosnia, against Serbs. It doesn't tell the other half of the story. That it was the American media that exposed the torture that went on in Abu Ghraib in the prisons of Iraq. It was the American media that exposed all of this. It's American lawyers that are attempting to get Guantanamo Bay shut down. This is debate happening within the American context. Likewise, this debate about terrorism and extremism is live and happening within the Muslim context. And so these are the half-truths that needs to be debunked, and let's all meet. And that's why I said help me out, guys, because we need to meet in the middle. And we need to get both sides to realize that the other side has a very bad impression of them. But actually we know that the truth isn't as simple as that.
Another question. Specifically, why is there so much violence against and oppression of women? Is this a problem of substance, or is it a problem of interpretation? Does the Quran specifically justify and condone it? Ayan, I think as the feminist, well, maybe everyone here is a feminist, but as the female feminist on the panel, I'll give you first crack at that.
Thank you very much. I find enough verses in the Quran and in the Hadith and in the practice of Islam to show that as a woman in Islam, you have to have a male guardian, you don't own your sexuality, all the examples that I mentioned. So that is meat, it's substance. And when I call for a reformation, I am calling for an editing, a review of that, so that men who do not want to oppress women can find consistency within their scripture and the way they practice Islam. Right now, what you see when it comes to violence, whether it is against women or against religious minorities, or even Shias and Sunnis, what you see is there are peace-loving Muslims who are put in a position of cognitive dissonance. They want to live, and they do lead lives that are not consonant with what the Quran says and the example of the Prophet Muhammad. And I think the way forward is to stop the denial, the evasion, and to look at this and to modify it. We live in a country that allows us to do that. The United States is founded on innovation, and there's this enormous opportunity today for Muslims. As we look at the world that we were born in and the world we come from, there's this enormous opportunity here in the US to look at scripture in the eye and to innovate and to reform. And unless that is done, that dissonance is going to be there. And the people who invoke the verses and the practice of the Prophet to justify the subjection of women and to justify violence will always be there. So my message is, right now there is an opportunity for reform. I have this printed out, and I'm just waiting for that challenge that it's not in the Quran. You should go to a website called Islam, a Religion of Peace, and someone has documented 109 verses from the Quran and the Hadith. So in the world we live, the Quran is a small book, it can be read, and everyone can see what it says.
I'm only coming to you as the moderator on this question because I'm looking for clarity, but you could do the same thing with the Old Testament.
Oh, you can, but the Christians have gone through that. The Christians have had their inquisitions and their crusades and the witch burnings, and they are past that, so that violence is now an issue of the fringe. Islam is right in the middle of it, and a true leadership, a compassionate leadership who love Muslims would be a leadership that would now modify, innovate, and reform.
Would you care to respond?
Yeah, sure. Well, of course, there are plenty of passages. Part of the work we're attempting to do at my organization, if you're going to go to a website, go to quilliamfoundation.org. So part of the work we're doing is, as the twin challenges that I mentioned of Islamism and fundamentalism, I do a lot of the work on the Islamism side because, as I mentioned at the start, I'm not a devout religious leader. So I discuss on the political side integration, social cohesion, policy advice on how to deal with some of these issues. But we've got somebody at Quilliam called Dr. Osama Hassan, who's the UK's leading reform theologian. And what he's attempting to do is look at these genuinely challenging passages in the Quran. There are those that apparently lend to a strong interpretation that a husband is allowed to subjugate the wife must obey the husband, polygamy, slavery. All of these passages are in the Quran. As you rightly mentioned, they're also in the Old Testament. Lot was said to marry his daughters and all this stuff. So we need theologians to reinterpret all of this in a context today that makes sense. And my challenge to literalists, people like Al-Qaeda terrorists, is the following. If you're going to use passages of the Quran that allow you to beat your wives and subjugate your wives, then likewise, we have to take everything else literally too, which means the reintroduction of slavery. It means everything that was practiced in the medieval era needs to be brought back in. If you're going to defend polygamy, defend slavery, defend taking concubines in the battlefield, because all of that, if one were to take a literal interpretation, can be taken from any of the scriptures of the Abrahamic faiths. So of course, there are passages that are problematic. They do need to be looked at. There aren't enough scholars like Imam Faisal who are attempting this work. More like him and more like Dr. Osama Hassan are needed.
Thank you. Just like you said, there are passages in the Old Testament. But what people don't really understand is that a lot of this, as you mentioned earlier, a lot of the development of the jurisprudence and the different opinions of law were developed many, many years ago, 500, 1,000 years ago. Unfortunately, most people today, including people like whom you refer to Al-Qaeda, have not studied this. I mean, when you study our jurisprudence, when you study Islamic jurisprudence and different opinions, and there's this famous joke, ask 2 rabbis a question, you get 5 answers. That's our tradition. We have a minimum of 5 madhabs of fiqh. And the jurisprudence is extremely sophisticated. And this jurisprudence has been forgotten. This heritage has been forgotten. Much of our literary heritage, our intellectual heritage, our jurisprudential heritage has been forgotten. And most of these questions have already been addressed. As you yourself have said, when you began studying it, you discovered that scholars from 7 centuries ago had addressed all these questions, which people are now asking all over again, as if it has not been done. Now, having said that, yes, there's no perfection. Even in America, there is ongoing issues about equality of pay for between genders until recently. So in the Muslim world, things are not perfect. But if you go to different countries, you will not see that the issue of to claim that the issue of women is uniformly negative all over the Muslim world is a myth.
That's because you're a man.
No. If you go to listen, go to Indonesia, go to Malaysia, go to many countries, women in terms of many of these issues that you're talking about have different status. I mean, look, there have been 5 women heads of state in the Muslim world. We're still waiting to have a female president of the United States. Does this mean that the state of
Muslim
gender...
I'm
sorry?
You almost said Muslim president of the United States.
Yes. Unless you believe that Obama is one. But the fact of the matter is that, and a lot of these things have to do with the particular cultures involved. Yes, women cannot drive in Saudi Arabia, but women are doing all kinds of things in other countries of the Arab Muslim world. And the next coming Secretary General of the OIC...
There's a Reuters study that was published this week. 99.3% of Egyptian women are subjected to sexual harassment. They can't leave their homes. What do you say to that?
That's terrible.
Men who do it invoke Islam.
I'm very much against this, but I'm saying that you cannot make a generalized statement and paint this picture that everything is that women can't drive all over the Muslim world. It's not true.
I didn't say that. They can't drive in Saudi Arabia.
But I can tell you that the next Secretary of the OIC has put the issue of women's rights as number 1 on his agenda coming forward. We have as I mentioned, we have a project to combat FGM, to educate people educating imams in Afghanistan on the rights of their daughters, according to Islamic law, which most of the people didn't know. So there's a lot of ignorance in the Muslim world about this issue of Malala is a travesty. The Prophet has said in several ahadith, it's the duty of a Muslim to learn from the cradle to the grave. And we have examples of women who are scholars. So this idea of shooting Malala because she wanted to get an education is fundamentally at odds with our own primary fundamental heritage.
Let me then bring
so
to
these
you,
are the issues which we need to educate our people on.
Let me bring to you, and I think the answer that you've given to the next question sounds like yes. Linda asks, are moderate Muslims then simply choosing to ignore violent passages in the Quran, seeing them as a product of a certain time and place, just as most Christians do with the Bible?
It's partly the truth, but it's what people need to understand is that the Quran is not every verse in the Quran is regarded as relevant or as universal. There's a myth that many Muslims in this last century have begun to adopt, that every verse in the Quran is eternally applicable in every context. This is not part of our intellectual juridical tradition. And this is where mistakes have begun to occur. So the vast majority of moderates, yes, but those who are scholarly and understand the jurisprudence are able to argue. This is why the work we're doing is important, because you cannot create change from the outside. You have to create change from within. It was the American Catholic bishops, in the writings of people like John Courtney Murray, that changed the Vatican's position on separation of church and state. Until Vatican II in 1965, the Vatican didn't subscribe to a separation of church and state. So it has to be done from scholarship and from within the community.
Well, where does that put you, Ayan, if change needs to come from inside?
Yeah.
But you comment on this, but you stepped outside. Where does that put you in this
dialogue? And it's not only me. It's not that throughout the history of Islam, there have been individuals who call for some form of innovation. But then what happens? They get ostracized, they get kicked out, they are thrown into exile, into prison, or they're killed. And that needs to stop. I think it's a huge progress that the three of us are sitting here tonight.
But that's a different question from the one. You made a personal choice to leave Islam. You did not leave Islam because you raised questions and challenges and were pushed out. You actually wrote that you were enjoying a glass of wine and said, "Why should I go to hell for this?" Was kind of your turning point moment. So it was your choice.
Yeah, but I didn't go out and say I am no longer a member of the community. But just by seeking consonance with my moral practice and my lifestyle, I was told by the community, you are not one of us, you are an infidel. And after repeated calls of being an infidel and a liar and a traitor and so on, I adopted the title infidel as something that I am proud of, because it means that I can look at myself honestly.
I'll just bring this for the last time. I'm really asking, if you've stepped outside the faith to the point that you call yourself an atheist, what standing does that give you in the conversation to talk about change I'm just following up on the Imam's point, that let's work from within. So where are you in that process?
Well, first of all, as someone who has, when you say stepped out, I don't mean stepped out of the community, but stepped out of the idea that I'm going to burn in hell unless I submit to a God who demands all kinds of things that I find immoral. So I find that then reaching that mental state of consonance and being at peace with what I am and who I am, it's so much easier for me to now look back and read the Quran, but this time with new eyes, and think, here are things that I would edit out. I look at the example of the Prophet Muhammad and I can come to, I recognize things that he, for instance, said, at that point, the killing and burying of little girls, that is something that is forbidden. In the context of the 7th century, the Prophet Muhammad made or created laws that advanced the position of women at that time. But it's also possible to look at his own lifestyle critically and what came afterwards, and to say in the 20th and in the 21st century, we need to reflect on this and we need to reform that. And it seems to me as if you remain a believer, a Muslim believer, that it becomes very hard to argue with the concept of God or to argue with the moral guide of Islam. I mean, the two gentlemen sitting here tonight demonstrate that. The Quran is forever perfect. Everybody else has misunderstood it. Those of us who criticize it have misunderstood it. Those who act according to the violent passages have misunderstood it. And if you become an atheist, then you can do that without flinching.
Maajid, come on in.
I just...
And I think it's progress.
I think the very fact we're here, I mean, you're asking Ayan the role that Ayan can have in this debate. I think she has a role. And I think that I'm going to get into a lot of trouble for saying this. But she has a role, and it's crucial. And that is that these conversations have taken far too long to happen within Muslim communities. We as Muslims have to come to terms. We have to come to terms with the fact that there will be a portion from within our communities whose conscience dictates to them they no longer want to believe in the faith. And we have to come to terms with how to deal with that in a civil context and have civil conversations. I speak to Ayan off stage. I like her. She's a very polite civil lady.
Thank goodness.
And I call upon...
I like you too.
I call upon every other Muslim listening tonight to... They will come across ex-Muslims in their life because they are a growing number. Yeah. To reconcile themselves to this fact that there will be people from among their communities whose conscience dictates to them they no longer want to believe. And our response to that must be, like we're seeing here, the Imam is a religious leader. He's not swearing at her, he's not spitting at her, and other Muslims who are watching need to take lesson from this because frankly, out there on the streets, that is a sort of reaction that is common. It's a very fierce, a very violent reaction.
On the question of leadership,
Thank you.
We have this... We have this question that is signed Lutherans in Williamsburg. It's from Lutherans in Williamsburg. They ask, are there leaders in Islam who are chosen to be spokesmen on a wider plane, such as a pope or a presiding bishop? I'm wondering, for instance, when an extremist perpetuates an act of violence in praise of Allah, are there leaders beyond local Muslim communities who are in the position of condemning such an act?
Our problem is that we don't have a church in the sense that the churches have an organized, institutionalized church. So we don't have people who are, you might say, the equivalent of a pope or a head of a church to make those pronouncements. However, there have been Islamic scholars who have positions like the chief muftis or major Muslim scholars who have made such pronouncements and condemned these acts of violence. Unfortunately, these messages are not heard.
Why?
The media doesn't cover it. I mean, for example, after 9/11, I was part of the group of people who condemned 9/11. I was approached, I give you a particular story, this is just one of several. I was approached by the religious editor of the New York Times on an issue of a fatwa that was raised by the Muslim chaplain of the US Armed Forces, who raised the question as to whether it was okay for Muslims to fight in the war in Afghanistan, to go to search for Osama bin Laden, and to kill him because they would be killing a fellow Muslim. This question was given to 5 major muftis in the Arab world, and they defined this act of 9/11 as an act of terrorism, haraba, and said that this is a capital crime, and to go after those people was, in fact, in accordance with Islamic law. I begged them to put this story on the front page of at least the Nation Challenge section, if not on the front page of the first section. Unfortunately, it was buried in page 8 of the Nation Challenge section. So these kinds of stories, I think, I mean, I said this particular story about this fatwa and the jurisprudence and the logic behind it would have been very interesting to the American readers and very important to show the kind of understanding and the kind of opinions which are available in the Muslim world. On the issue of women, you may not, and again, you're not aware of this, but the retired Chief Justice of Malaysia has rendered a very interesting paper on the issue of women and how he interpreted the issue of Islamic jurisprudence as not having been fixed by the time of the Prophet, but having been evolved. And upon the issue of slavery, he said, I've asked Muslim scholars all over, should you reinstitute slavery because it existed at the time of the Prophet? From a reading of the Quran and the teachings of the Hadith, it is clear that Islam is against slavery, although did not ban it at that time. And therefore, the banning of slavery is consistent with its ethics. So he argued on a similar basis, based upon what the Prophet accomplished for women's rights in his time, that we too, as time goes on, have to advance the ultimate maqasid, the objectives of Islamic jurisprudence, to continuously perfect the reality of the community to the ideals of our faith. So these types of debates have been going on. The fact of the matter is that you don't hear about them.
There's no church, there's no core country or core actor that can, like the Pope, say, okay, now this is the direction we're going in. But today, I've been following events since the Arab Spring, and I see grassroots movements, women that organize themselves in the various countries who are fighting for their rights, homosexuals who organize themselves, ex-Muslims. Maajid, what is your status? Sort of almost ex-Muslims.
I've just been excommunicated.
Almost ex-Muslims. So there are grassroots.
You're trying to get me killed or what?
Well, I mean, I'm really happy with your evolution. We debated 3 years ago, and what you said tonight and what you were saying 3 years ago are quite different. And it's an evolution that I'm happy with. But there are these. There are these seemingly small groups, but they're a growing number of people. And I think, in a way, it is good that we no longer need, and I really mean respectfully, that the House of Islam is no longer going to rely on the clergymen and Muslim scholars to advance the quality of their lives and to live according to their consciences. People are taking that opportunity themselves. And it's only a matter of time before either there is a pure reformation or the majority of Muslims will be ex-Muslims.
I have a question that's not signed, but it's a pretty good question. The word jihad has not come up once tonight. Is this term not a huge part of the perception of Islam as a violent religion?
Certainly. I mean, the word jihad means to strive in the way of God. And striving in the way of God is something that all of us are meant to do. The word jihad in our jurisprudence, in our theology, refers not only to an act of a just war, but as the Prophet said in one of his major sayings after he came back from battle, he said, we are returning from the minor jihad to the greater jihad. And when his companions were bothered by that, he said, the jihad against the self. So the concept jihad really is the constant striving that we have to improve both ourselves and our communities and the world to be a better place. Of course, the military aspect is one interpretation, and that's the one which has become far more emphasized in the perception of many non-Muslims and in the perception of the militants, the kind of people who recruit the kind of people that Maajid was.
Yeah, so just to touch on what Ayan just said about my state of faith. Look, I want to tell a story here, okay? I joined the radical Islamist group Hizb ut-Tahrir at 16 years old, and I used to try and recruit people. As I mentioned, I didn't join from a mosque, and we tried to recruit people from mosques. And around the age of 18 years old, I was punched around the face outside a mosque by a worshipper who came out and said, you're ruining our image, our religion, you're perverting our faith, get away from here. And I refused to move. My flyer that I was handing out simply said, Muhammad was a politician. That's all it said. And that provoked him because he said, how dare you bring politics into our mosque? Get away from here. I refused to move, and he punched me in the face. And basically there was a bit of a struggle, and I left in the end. I was too small to sort of. He was quite a big man.
I'll bet you like that guy now.
Yeah, well, this is what happened next, you see. Fast forward 10 years, 15 years, and I left Hizb ut-Tahrir, and I began trying to I was in Pakistan, and I'm basically trying to tell young Muslims there that we mustn't politicize our religion, and I got punched in the face again. This time by a member of my former group who jumped across and then sort of whacked, he was an amateur boxer, so again I had no chance. He knocked me to the floor. And the moral behind this story is the following: that look, debates move on and ideas change. When I first started preaching Islamism, it was alien to Muslim ears to the point where it provoked violence. By the time I started trying to reverse the Islamism that I played a part in propagating, it was the default, and saying that we must divorce Islam from politics became alien to Muslim ears. And this comes to Ayan's point. When I debated you 2 years ago, basically the debate has moved, it's shifted even since then. I am able to say a lot more things openly now than I was even then. So
even in 2 years?
Even within 2 years. I mean, as well as the fact that at that debate I met my fiancée, which makes me a lot happier. The debate itself has shifted to a point where I can sit here and say openly, feeling relatively more secure for my position in Britain, that we have to, as Muslims, come to terms with the fact that when people's conscience tells them to leave the faith, they are obliged to follow their conscience and not the scripture, because there is no faith without conscience. I can say that here now a lot more confidently because I know that even among the theological discourse, that debate globally has shifted. And so I'm optimistic that things are moving forward as well.
All right.
Can I
yes,
insert one very brief comment? I was invited as part of a delegation to Iran back in 2003. We met a very well-known Ayatollah, whose name I shall not mention, who was under house arrest at the time. And he told us, whoever follows his or her conscience, truly follows their conscience, is a Muslim, being submitted to God, even if they apostatize.
So you're in. I have this next question. I am virtually certain you have not prepared an answer, any one of the three of you. We change the world by what we teach our children. What would Muhammad say if he were a modern-day prophet to all of our children on Facebook and Twitter? And a note, please remember, by our children we mean Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, agnostic, atheist, and so on.
Who wants to go first?
Well, I can't speak for a dead man, and it's a hypothetical, but I would say that for people who, you know, Muhammad came and he innovated religion in Mecca in his own time. And perhaps he would come now and innovate, and he would probably throw 1/3 of the Quran into the rubbish bin and say, let's start all over again.
Well,
and maybe he's the only one who can do it.
If he did that, being a prophet, he'd have had the authority of God to do so, so it would still be revelation. What I think...
Why do you need only prophets to make changes?
No,
Why do you have to claim to be a prophet?
I didn't say you do. I was saying within, if you were to make
Are we off the Facebook?
So, so Facebook and Twitter. Yeah. Look, the Prophet Muhammad during his time, as Ayan conceded as well, was relatively progressive for the desert age that he came from, right? So I think that in that spirit, if he was around today, he'd probably tell all the Muslims that he sees to get out the Stone Age, get out the medieval era, and get with the times.
Dave and Jane Kearney ask, what can America do to help?
I have a request. America, since September 11, 2001, has been helping and focusing and picking, you know, the leaders, those who say that Islam is a religion of peace and who try to reinterpret it and who try to tell us what we want to hear. I want to say, please, Americans, whether it's politicians or civil society, there are now individuals, especially in those Arab Spring countries, women fighting for women's rights, homosexual Muslims fighting for their civil rights, religious minorities. These are the individuals and the groups that you need to help. They are floundering, they are under-resourced, and they are our allies when it comes to our value systems of individual freedom and conscience. They're the ones who need our help. We need to shift and start helping them.
Imam, same question. Same question. What can America do to help?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the real battlefront is not between America and Islam or Muslims and other faith traditions, but really is to get what I call coalitions of moderates, teams to focus on the specific issues which have created this sense of division, and to strengthen the moderate voices and address the causes, the underlying causes of the problems that we see today. And to work together, and it requires working together on several fronts. The political front, and address certain political issues, address issues of governance, address issues of human rights and various civil rights, including those that Ayan had mentioned. Creating a rule of law, a proper rule of law, and the Islamic rule of law from the tradition that is an enlightened tradition, because our tradition in its fundamental time was progressive and was an enlightened tradition. To bring that tradition back, and that I think is among the things which are most important to address: the political, theological, religious, and legal.
But what's the American role in that?
America has a lot of influence, because America has soft power. You know, we have very strong presences in many parts of the Muslim world, but also there's something else. When I looked at the role of religion, or the role of American religion, we call it that. In other words, if you look at the American Catholics, had an enormous influence on the Vatican. American Judaism reframed global Judaism. And that is why I believe that a development of a robust American Islam will also have a profound effect upon the Muslim world, because America is the modern Rome. It's the modern, it's the new global superpower. And already American Muslims have been playing and punching above their weight in many cases. I mean, the fact that democracy is being advanced in many countries, even with great difficulty, is because American Muslims have been lobbying our government for the values that most Muslims share. I mean, the Pakistani young men who were fighting Maajid, I'm sure at the same time they were asking him if they could get a visa to come to the United States. So
the guy was actually a British Pakistani, British passport. Yeah.
Okay, but my point is that, I mean, wherever I've gone, I found that people actually want for their own countries the kind of lifestyle we have here in America.
Maajid, your answer to that question.
Yeah.
And you can broaden it out if you want to include the UK.
I think we should reframe the debate. I think not every Muslim identifies or self-identifies as a Muslim, So if I were to, say, meet you, John, in Richmond on an average Saturday night, the first thing you'd say to me when you introduce yourself wouldn't be, "Hi, I'm John, I'm a Christian." Maybe it would, but I don't think so.
Right.
I don't get that impression from you. So, likewise, most Muslims don't primarily identify as Muslims when interacting generally with people. As Ayan said, some are Muslim and homosexual, some are Muslim and feminist, some are Muslim and devout and do identify primarily as Muslim. Others are Muslim professionals. Not everyone wears the same hat. Now, what happens is, when we engage, we force the conversation down one narrow train of thought, and that's because sometimes the questions we ask. So if we were to engage and say, "So how does it feel being a Muslim in Pakistan?" the person will immediately put their Muslim hat on, even if they've never prayed in their lives, and say, "Well, as a Muslim in Pakistan," and what that does is it exacerbates the problem of the identity politics that I spoke about. That basically then we've immediately set up a scenario where we're identifying as Christian and Muslim, when that conversation could have easily have been teacher to teacher or student to student, human to human. I think we need to recalibrate the way we approach this debate.
I found that a very interesting point. It brought back to me the time when I was covering Moscow at the collapse of the Soviet Union, and my editors were always asking me to go out and ask Russians, "Do you have hope for the future?" And so every night I was reporting, "The Russians have no hope for the future." Not that they weren't having that they were having that conversation. We have time for one more question, and it's very forward-looking. And maybe one or two sentences from each of you. 50 years from now, Do you believe the world will still have reason to ask the question that we have been asking tonight? In other words, is there any significant change in sight? Imam?
I believe that in 50 years we will have a much better place, certainly if we have anything to do about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's, of course, I hope that in 50 years, the violence we see today that is invoked and that's perpetrated in the name of Islam will not be there. But we've entered now with the Arab Spring a period when there is a youth bulge, a huge demography of young people who live in and are struggling to live and survive in societies that are authoritarian and where there are religious fanatics. And that has just started to play itself out. I left Somalia in 1990 November, and in January of 1991 the civil war started, and now it is over 20 years, and Somalia is still in civil war. So 2 decades, 3 decades, 4 decades are really not that much. I don't want to be over-optimistic. I really hope that things change, but I think we have to guard ourselves today for more violence, particularly intra-Islam, so Sunnis and Shias. Iran is developing a bomb. Saudi Arabia is competing and supporting Pakistan to get that bomb. Egypt may want one. Turkey may want one. These are terrible, terrible scenarios to consider, and it's not something that's going to be resolved very, very quickly. I hope it is, but okay. I'm a little cautious
Maajid,
on that.
last word.
Well, it's very easy for us to be pessimistic. Let's not forget one thing, though. Take ourselves back just over 60 years ago in the past, and Europe was locked in World War II, in the most terrible conflict that the history of man knows. And now Europe has an economic union. Okay, fine, it's not doing too well at the moment.
It's doing well.
But we're not fighting each other anymore. So the Middle East, though it looks like it's a mess, it's not World War II. I think 50 years in the future, we may end up with a scenario where people have decided to reconcile on a lot of these issues. What I'd love to see is everyone having coffee-colored children, all the men speaking Italian, and all the women speaking French.
All right, well, 50 years from now, it's a Saturday night, and we'll see you all there. Thank you, and good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm John Donvan, and you were just watching a conversation that took place under the auspices of the Richmond Forum this past Saturday at the Landmark Theater before a sold-out crowd, where the topic was Islam, and the question phrased was this: is Islam a religion of violence or of peace? And the purpose of this conversation that's about to unfold now is to bring this conversation back to Richmond, to this community. And I want to introduce three citizens, denizens of Richmond, who will be taking part in this conversation. From nearest me, Imam Amar Amanet, who leads the Islamic Center of Virginia, the Reverend Bill Sachs of the St. Stephen's Episcopal Church and also the Center for Interfaith Reconciliation, and Rabbi Ben Romer of the congregation Or Ami. And I'm just going to share very quickly that the three of you are longtime friends, obviously connected by the previous conversation just as we were beginning, that food unites all of you. A lot of other things unite all of you. And what is it that brings the three of you together, and when did you connect with one another? Reverend?
For, I don't know, 5 or 6 years maybe, we have periodically been having lunch, and we have other colleagues in all of our faiths who floating out of the group. We've done other things. We've done some joint Habitat for Humanity projects. We've gone to Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's home, to talk about the meaning of religious freedom in America. We have found, by God's grace, we have found an incredible ability to talk to one another about anything. About
even hard conversations?
Sorry?
Even the hard conversations?
Even the hard conversations.
Well, let me
talk about it all.
Let me get then to what may be a hard conversation, and that is the notion that what we saw was a conversation where we were actually weighing the peaceableness of one religious faith. It was this question: is Islam a religion of violence or of peace? Which to a Muslim in itself, let's face it, would represent something of an affront to have that on a poster. At the same time, let's recognize that to a large part of the American population, the story of Islam as violent is the one that they know, which was the purpose of our even having that conversation in the first place. But an interesting question came from the audience among hundreds of questions, and most of them were actually spectacular. But a man named Brellan Hillman, I believe a man, wrote, "Are there any viable methods to reframe the discourse? And if so, what are they? And if not, how can they be developed?" So, Imam, let me ask you this. Was the question that was put before the audience at the forum the right question to be asking?
Well, no. And you have to realize that the Richmond Forum is part of Richmond, and it affects thousands of people in Richmond, and there are upwards of 10,000 Muslims who are our neighbors here in this city and in the region. And people may not know who their neighbors are, and when you frame something in a general way, it sounds like you're talking about this scary force that is from far away. Not that you're talking about your neighbors who live and work and go to school with you. And so how we frame things like that affects our community and every member in our community. We could have turned that and made it about another religion, but I'm pretty sure that if it were about Judaism, that perhaps the Jewish community would have been consulted about that, and if we brought extremist viewpoints about any Christian or any followers of any religion, that we would consult with the local community that's going to be affected directly by that.
Well, Rabbi, you were at the conversation.
Yes.
You were in the audience. What did you take away from it that actually would address the Imam's point to the broader community having a different understanding of who their neighbors are?
Well, of course, everybody was outside of the community who was there, but I think the interchange was helpful in letting people who might not have any background understand some of the diversity and the difficulty of the discussion. And so it was helpful by getting people in, but it's at times almost inflammatory by the framework that you use. And for me, the challenge is, how do you, again, frame the discussion? And the minute you say violence, there we go. And I know that's how we talk about things. It's always the alarming headlines. But for us here, the successful part of what's going on is that we meet once a year, and we share food, and we share thoughts, and we meet each other, and in a trialogue, Jews, Christians, and Muslims talking together, we meet each other and talk with each other rather than at. And that's one of the challenges in a difficult situation like this, where you bring up topics, and then what do you do with it after you walk away?
Reverend, you want to add to that?
Yes, I think the real issue is that we are not in any sufficient way talking to and with one another. Mm-hmm. I think you alluded to this during the program, someone did, when you said that one of the things we don't talk about is religion. The problem is we desperately need to talk about our faith, and when we do, I think more often than not we discover commonalities. We discover that we are neighbors. We discover that we care about the same city and the same region. We care about the schools and the healthcare and the transportation. We live here together. But it takes coming to the table, it takes creating occasions to get to know one another, and then the reward is extraordinary.
Do you recognize, though, that for some people that may seem like a frightening thing to do, a scary thing to do, and at minimum an awkward thing to do, to approach someone of a different faith with a real intention of wanting to have that conversation but not knowing how to do it, how to enter into it?
I certainly understand and respect that,
yeah.
But I come back to some very practical things. I think there are ways to convene that reduce the tension. The simplest way is around a meal. And we've done some of these in local congregations. And we've put people at tables with 6 or 7 or 8 people at a table, mixing up the different faiths. And people talk about their families. They talk about how they like to cook or like to go out to eat. It comes back to basics.
And it keeps coming back to food, I notice.
And it does come back.
But you know why? It's the universal, it's a universe, it's oxygen.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I mean, for me, the challenge is we have to have religion and the broad base of what religion is. Islam, Judaism, Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, all the different groups talking. Without the faith community's input, and the total faith community's input, then what you have are the loudest voices that we hear. Mm-hmm. So you hear the loudest voices, which tend to be the more strident voices from certain sides. And we talked about that last night, mm-hmm. about who do you hear the most and who threatens you the most are the ones that have the big sticks and the loudest voices. And what happens is we lose the dynamic of the total discussion about where people really are. So you only get an image of what you hear in the sound bites that show up, rather than where people really are, and the importance of religion and faith and spirituality in the very real world discussions of everything that we deal with.
Imam, tell me about the Muslim community in Richmond. How big is it? How old is it? And who's there? And
the Muslim community is it's been here for a long, long time, but it's been an invisible community. It's been really growing in the last 40 plus years, and is now more than 10,000 people here locally. And in Virginia is a very large concentration of Muslims, of course, more in northern Virginia. The Muslim community is extremely diverse. There are people who are refugees who are just arriving on our shores from every possible area in the world. There are people who've been here for generations. The sort of mainstays of our community are professional people, people who work in medical field, education, industry, and government, and people who are in the military. And we have, of course, in every Muslim community, plenty of service members as well. And so you can't really stereotype the community as one thing or another. It represents people of every ethnic background, mm-hmm. every income level, every education level.
Every education level. I had a sense from when you were talking about the professional level, medicine, university positions, mm-hmm. that there was a more of a bend towards being highly educated.
The Muslim community in the United States on a whole is statistically more educated and affluent than perhaps the Christian community, even though we're 1% of the population. But it is actually very diverse. So we have people who have just migrated here who don't even speak English, mm-hmm. and we have people from poor backgrounds. Mm-hmm. But
at the Richmond Forum, we didn't discuss this because everyone on the stage, but myself, was Muslim. But now we have a Muslim, a Jew, and a Christian. Sounds like the beginning of a joke.
It's
Walk
a
into
joke,
a bar.
Yeah.
But tell me about you have used the word commonalities among the faiths. So we all three faiths recognize Abraham. All three faiths worship one God. But those are the basics, and those are important basics. But beyond that, when you chat with one another, do you discover more differences or more similarities, or a rich treasury of both of those things? Reverend?
Oh, I think we see more similarities. Just before the camera began rolling, we were talking about commonalities in practice between Muslims and Jews, and the Jewish origin of certain Christian ideas. We have common roots, and I would also add that when we convene people to talk about our commonalities, we find similarities in ways we pray, and similarities in ways we try to teach our children the values of the faith. So we have deep, deep common roots.
Rabbi?
I think for me the challenge is always being confident spiritually in your own faith, to understand that when you start sharing with each other, you find out the commonalities actually enrich yourself.
What do you mean about confident in your own faith?
Much of the time we talk with each other is we come from a level of, I don't know enough about my own faith, mm-hmm. let alone what I don't know about yours. Most Jews don't know that much about Islam. They really don't know that much about Christianity. Most Christians don't know that much about Judaism. They certainly don't know that much about Islam. And most Muslims aren't any better educated in most cases about the other religions as well. So we only know bits and pieces and straw men and straw women that we set up. The more we know about each other, the more that we find that we share certain common values of care for the soul, care for the person, care for the community, and realize that as we learn more about each other, we enhance our own sense of confidence within our own religious community and can reach out more confidently and more cooperatively to realize all of us together create a much greater sense of spiritual and religious strength.
Yeah. All three of the communities are of Middle Eastern origin. They share common heritage. They're all from that Semitic culture of the ancient Near East. And we have a lot in common. We celebrate our religious values differently, but we share the same ethical and moral values and the same commitment to the same basic commandments of caring for our fellow man and our community. But those are celebrated with different ritual actions that are different and unique and valuable. We were talking about the fact that you can't interpret the Quran without reference to Judaism and Christianity. And I think in Christianity is dependent also on the Jewish roots. And all of us need the other, and we can't actually, in fact, we are richer because of our association, and we would be poorer without the other. And it gives us a meaning and purpose. Comparing and contrasting it makes us all understand our own tradition better.
All right, so we've spent a couple of minutes talking about what's common, and the fact that this was controversial in the first place goes not only to the fact of the way that the question was phrased at the forum, but also, Reverend, as you said, that there are also difficult conversations to be had. So rather than leave this being just a love fest, which it's great that it can be, and it's clear that you're all comfortable with one another, let's talk a little bit about what the difficult conversations are. Reverend, what is it that it's hard to talk about?
One thing that's certainly hard to talk about is a conflicted history. I mean, in the case of Christianity, there was an episode 1,000 years ago known as the Crusades, and in fact a series of episodes known as the Crusades. And that word, in some sense, has been seized upon by extremists to try to flag.
Who's extremists?
Well, in this case, I think Middle Eastern extremists, primarily Muslim extremists, who would flag the Crusades as an episode that characterizes Christianity for all time and characterizes Western political intentions today. And the Crusades are certainly an episode in the history of Christianity that are regretful, to say the least, if not shameful. So we have a conflicted history that we do need to move beyond, and I can't say that without mentioning the Holocaust as well, as an issue of conflict against a people that is shameful in human history. So for me, however, these difficult issues in the past and the differences among us today are not impediments, they're incentives.
And Rabbi, I'm going to ask you whether just the existence of Israel and Palestine, which is by and large Jewish and Muslim?
I think that is a question, of course, on many levels it's political, and we talked about that last night. Is it religious? Well, sometimes both sides will take religion and use it as text as pretext. But it is an issue that has to be discussed. And it's a hard question. And the Jewish community has to deal with it. The Islamic community has to deal with it.
But what do you say in that conversation? What is that conversation?
Well, I might say something different than others will. But I have certain views on which I don't believe that Judaism can legitimately say that another people can remain in a secondary situation when it comes to their own governance and their own freedom. And that's not a Jewish value, so I have to look at two-state solutions and issues of that nature, and yet still understand that the full right and privilege of a Jewish state to be a thriving Jewish state there. But that it should not be to the exclusion of other people.
And do you find that you can have that conversation, first of all, with other Jews, And can you have that conversation with Muslims in a constructive way, where anything positive actually comes out of it, aside from both of you asserting your points of view?
Well, I think sometimes I can have a more effective conversation on the Islamic side than in some cases in the Jewish community. I think, yes, we're ready for those discussions. Those are hard discussions we have to get past, talking at each other and talking about and with each other on how to come to conclusions that are spiritually beneficial and appropriate for everybody.
And Imam, same question for you. What are the hard conversations?
Muslims, Christians, Jews, Americans of all faiths have ideals, and they believe very often that they have ideals which are valuable and that should be shared, and they sometimes reach others who oppose some of their viewpoints. But we have this idea that we can use violence to eliminate opposition to our ideals. And so we justify that. We might use violence because in the name of democracy, or in the name of capitalism, or in the name of Islam, or any other religion. And that is a common problem of humanity, where we have today Buddhist monks leading massacres of Muslim civilians. And we don't have to talk about terrorism in the name of Islam, which is all over the media. And so the real question, the real hard topic, is why we still are convinced that violence is going to solve our problems on this planet. And that's a problem that all of us share, and that none of us are free from or innocent of.
So last thing I want to ask you, the three of you getting along with one another, yeah, no, you're role models out there, but how difficult is it for people to be you? Are you special guys in having figured this out? Did you have to work at this? Did you make a decision to do this, or did it just kind of come up naturally?
It came up naturally. I will say that I think each of us had to have a certain comfort level to even get together with one another in the first place. But once we got together, we discovered that we cared about this community. We discovered that our faiths had really brought us together, and then we found that we liked each other.
So it can work.
It can work.
I've met thousands of people, Christians, and especially Jews and people of other faiths and no faith, who come to our mosques or who invite us to come and speak at their places of worship or their schools or other forums. And I have met people who weren't very nice. And I've met Muslims I didn't like very much. But overall, most people are polite and nice. And if you can get over differences of opinion and look to the people as humans, you will usually find a good result in the end. And that's my experience. I keep my faith in humanity as a whole.
So I want to thank the three of you for taking the time with us. And again, to the Richmond Forum, we want to thank the Richmond Forum for bringing last Saturday's conversation to you, and also this conversation. I'm John Donvan. Thanks very much for joining us.